All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the 2019 State of Database DevOps report. And we're live with Donovan Brown. Well, he's live on audio. I don't know where exactly he is right now. The gentleman travels way more than I do. So I think every time we've emailed in the last week, he's in a different location. So it's very interesting. But we're glad Donovan is here today. Yeah, it's crazy. So welcome to the report, sponsored by Redgate Software. We hire a company to do this every year, kind of in conjunction with what Puppet Labs and Accelerate and Dora and other organizations do about DevOps. We tend to focus on a database. And so today we wanted to go over our report, get some discussion and conclusions from the findings. And then we have Donovan Brown with us from Microsoft, he's the DevOps guy, I think. A couple of quick housekeeping items. We are recording this, so if you have to drop out or you come in late or something, we'll send an email later this week with the recording. And then if you have any questions or comments or things you want to get in touch with either Donovan or myself, in your control panel, which is usually in the upper right-hand corner, there's a little questions pane. You can pop that open and ask a question. So with that, let's get going. So my name is Steve Jones. I am kind of hosting today. I work for Redgate Software as an evangelist. So I go around talking and speaking and writing about both Redgate and SQL Server in general. But the main job I have is as a founder and editor of SQL Server Central. And I built that site with some partners as a way to help educate others and get them better at their jobs and promote better database code and better database practices. And I've done that for the last nearly 20 years. But I've been in databases for nearly 30 years at this point, and primarily SQL Server, but I've worked with other platforms and big and small companies, both as a developer and as a DBA. So I've had a lot of different experiences. My contact information is up there. And then the last thing is that Microsoft has honored me with the MVP award for the last 11 years, so I'm proud of that. And then our guest today is Donovan Brown, who is the principal DevOps manager at Microsoft. I think he's the main DevOps person that I see all over the world presenting and talking and promoting DevOps and better software. And Donovan, you want to tell us a little about yourself?
Yeah, so I started my career about 20 years ago at Compaq Computers. I was writing Windows software back then, and 7 years before I joined Microsoft, I was recruited by Notion Solutions to go off and help people install Team Foundation Server at the time and help them come from the waterfall world into the agile world. And to produce code really quickly, that meant you had to also learn how to do your database differently as well and start thinking vertically versus horizontally. And it really got me into that database world and how do we automate that process. And then when I came over to Microsoft, I obviously started focusing more on DevOps because I believe once you're really good at Agile, DevOps is the next natural transition, right? Now that you have this increment of shippable code, let's ship it. And that's where DevOps really comes in and helps you shine and take that product and push it out into production. So yeah, really happy to be here. And like I said, I've been a really big fan of Redgate since early in the 2000s when I found your products for the first time. So I'm always happy to be involved.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Donovan, not to embarrass a little bit, but he likes to go fast. So he's actually a race car driver.
Yeah.
And
so yeah, same thing on the track and in my code. I want everything to go fast, right? I want
everything fast.
Fast. Exactly.
Yeah. So if you ever meet Donovan somewhere, you should always challenge him to a game of ice hockey or air hockey. He loves that. He loves that. Yeah.
Very cool.
All right. So in our State of DevOps report, this is, I think it's our fourth or fifth year. I can't remember exactly, but we hire a company every year to go through this. So it's not just Redgate customers, but it's also just people in general that are working with database software and not even necessarily SQL Server. It could be on Oracle or Postgres or anything else. And so what we want to do is talk a little bit about the report, some of the things that came out of it, and give you some context, which may convince you to adopt DevOps or may give you some rationale or ammunition to talk to your boss or your company or other developers or other DBAs and get them to think about including the database in your software development process, in your DevOps process, and going faster. And then we want to spend a little bit of time at the end talking about Azure DevOps, because Azure DevOps has been an amazing platform for Microsoft, and that's one of the things we have Donovan here to talk about too. So last year, things changed a little bit in the State of DevOps report. The application software people have been doing this for a number of years. I think they've done it 8 or 9 years. And for the first time last year in the Accelerate report, they actually had questions on the database, and they talked with various customers and clients and people in the industry about including the database in DevOps. And so that really was a fundamental change. We actually did a webinar with Gene Kim last year, and we talked about that. And he mentioned that when they started trying to be more agile and do DevOps, they were worried about the database because it is fundamentally more difficult. There's some challenges with the database. And so they avoided talking about the database early on. And slowly through the last 5, 6, 7 years, more and more companies are realizing that you have to include the database. And it's not just to ship software fast or get features to customers, but the last few years have seen an increasingly larger number of legislative or industry standard requirements for your software. Compliance is becoming a bigger deal. Certainly with the GDPR last year, that has affected not only companies in Europe, but it has also influenced legislators in other places. For example, in California, they passed the Privacy Act last year. Various other US states have either passed or have in draft legislation as well. And DevOps really helps with that. So we want to talk a little bit about that. Now, I think one of the big things that when we think about the database, and this is something that I've heard Donovan preach about before, I've had the honor to present with him, is that you've got to include it in your software process. And Donovan, you've talked about that the database is important.
Yeah, what I tell people is when we're trying to take value and ship it to our end users as quickly as we possibly can, you can't do that if that value requires a schema change and you're afraid to do that, or you're going to do that manually off to the side outside of your DevOps pipeline. You want to automate everything that you can, and thanks to the tools that we have in the industry now, you can automate your database changes as well. Historically, that was very difficult, which is why it stayed manual for so long. And I think what reports like this are doing is they're bringing the awareness to the industry that, listen, you don't have to treat your database as this snowflake that can only be touched by human beings. You can now automate schema changes, database migrations, the whole 9 yards, such that it is just another component in the solution that you're trying to deploy to production. And if you want to move as fast as your competitors are, and they're already doing this, and you're not, you're going to lose. So it's time for you to realize that when you ship your application, it has to include everything that your application relies upon, your containers, your middle tier web services, and including your database as well. It's crucially important.
Yeah, I think there's another article that Donovan wrote that you talked about. If you think you're doing DevOps, so you're not including the database, I think you said something like you're kind of faking DevOps, because the database is an integral part of everything we do.
It is,
right?
It is. And another reason I think a lot of people have kind of pushed the database to the side is because historically it's been so difficult to upgrade that we literally would architect our application to not have to change the database schema, right? We'll make compromises inside of our application to work around the schema because we're so afraid to change it. And that's another reason it's been kind of left off to the side. But now it's time for us to rethink that, right? It doesn't have to be painful. And you can change it more frequently. When you're fearful of changing it, it doesn't change very often. So you don't think there's a lot of, you're not going to gain very much by automating something that only changes once every 6 months because you're afraid to change it. But when you realize that you're now free to change the schema like you would change a form on your website, all of a sudden you're free to just innovate at a pace that you've never done before. And again, it was the advent of the tooling and the products that allow us to be able to treat our database just like every other asset that's freeing people to innovate faster than they ever have before. But again, you can't tell me you're doing DevOps, and then when I ask you how you're doing your database, you get embarrassed and you don't want to make eye contact anymore because you know you're doing manual scripts written by a human being to do the deployments, right? And that's just, like you said, you're faking it at that point.
Right. And I think in the past, as database people, we've been nervous about those deployments because if they go wrong, it's a big deal, right? It's downtime or it's data integrity issues, all kinds of things. And Donovan and I were chatting earlier that we used to we stay up late or we'd be worried about those database changes, and that fear causes us to go slower. And then when we do that,
Really?
it slows the pace of development, or the developers start to do things like stick XML or JSON or extra stuff into columns because they just need it to work, right? Because they have to go faster. So I agree.
I'm a victim of that.
Yeah, I have been too. And I've been on the other side as a DBA where you try to limit the amount of change because you're worried about it. But we can't do that. I think we know at this point that waterfall isn't really a good method, and we need to be doing DevOps, right? Whether that's Agile or Scrum or something else, we've got to be going quicker. And we have to include a database. It's just fundamental.
Yep. Agreed.
All right. So, when we did this report, we had thousands of responses, and I thought this was kind of interesting, that we have not just developers and DBAs, but all through the stack of people in your organization that maybe don't even write any code, but they're responding to this report. And I think, Donovan, you probably see that when you go out and speak around the world, you talk to people of all different job titles of any industry that could be out there in any size company, right? It's not limited to startups or anything else.
Exactly. I think there's a quote, I didn't make this up, but they're like, DevOps is no longer for the unicorns. Horses can do this too, right? You don't have to be that special Netflix type of organization that's really the bleeding edge. The tooling that you need, the products that you need, they're readily available and many for free, right? There's no excuse for you not to go do this stuff. And it's amazing that no matter what industry that I'm in, I'm solving the exact same problems. It's just like, how do you not have this already? How are you, like, why are you not doing continuous integration? Like, how are you not taking the first steps towards this DevOps transformation that is it's crucial? Because I feel sad for some of our customers, because I'm thinking, I work for Microsoft. Pretty much the whole world is my customer, and I've already talked to your competition about this, right? You're like the last one in your industry I'm talking to. You should be frightened, right? You should be really afraid because everyone else is already doing this.
Yeah. And if they're not, then you're probably on the decline compared to other companies, because they can take advantage of opportunities or changes or adapt to legislation or anything else.
Yeah,
I
because
think
they've been thinking this way from the beginning. Right.
Yeah.
That's the thing when you have the younger companies that are coming up today, right? These companies they're starting off thinking this way. They don't have those battle scars that you and I have, right? They're not afraid to change the database because a lot of them are lucky enough to be working on greenfield applications. So this is just how they do their database changes. They're using migration scripts, or they're using somewhat stateful database migration tool that's going to allow them to be able to change their database fluently. But when you come from, like you said, our age, right, when you've been burned by this several times and you're afraid of it, it's really hard to convince them to move. And that's what I hope, like you said, reports like this are going to shine the light on. You don't have to be afraid anymore. There's ways of doing this, and DevOps is a really good way for you to start making a lot of strides and making up some of the ground you might have lost against your competition.
Right. And even if you are an old company, so this has been one of the fascinating things for me. So I'm slightly older than you, Donovan, but you've been at Microsoft for a number of years.
Yep.
You guys are an older company, and you had very traditional software development practices, right? Like, SQL Server, it took 3 or 4 or 5 years every time to release a new version. Visual Studio, the same. And you have really adapted a DevOps process inside Microsoft, and it's incredible.
Actually, exactly. So, yeah, the team that we're going to talk about in a little bit, the Azure DevOps teams, actually uses Azure DevOps to develop the product itself, which is kind of this cool inception thing. But we went from shipping every 3 years to shipping every 3 weeks. And we actually ship 2 hot fixes or any type of maintenance fixes that we need to twice a day. So we went from, we'll see you 3 years from now, to we're going to see you twice a day for the rest of your life, right? It's just like, it's unbelievable. But it took re-architecting and rethinking pretty much everything that we do, how we deal with database changes, because we're not going to take the system down to update the database.
Right.
Like, it has to be updated in real time while it's running and while people are actively using it. And I tell a lot of people, it's not just about getting the right tools and products in place. You might have to rethink your architecture to make sure that you can move at the pace in which you want to move.
Right. And you guys are thousands of people in the Azure DevOps area, right?
Yeah, there's 700 engineers, right? But that doesn't include all the PMs and everything else, but just the engineering team alone. That's 50 feature teams, about 10 to 12 people per team, all across the world, merging into master every day.
Yeah. So that's an order of magnitude larger than Redgate as a company. And we do the same thing. So it's kind of amazing,
Right.
like we have most of our teams ship every week. Some, may ship this week, and they may have to ship a hotfix tomorrow or the next day because they're working. But whether, you're our size at Redgate, which is really, we're on the order of 50, 60 developers, or you're hundreds or thousands of developers at Microsoft, you can do this stuff. And that's kind of what this report shows, that it doesn't really matter your size, your industry, or what you do, you can be a part of this. And what I thought was interesting is that of the people that responded, most of these organizations are doing DevOps in some way. So it might just be one group inside the company, but they're thinking about it. So if you're a DBA and you're nervous or scared about DevOps, you shouldn't be. You should start thinking about it. And if you're a developer, you should be talking to the DBAs or anybody in charge of the database, say, we've got to do this stuff because it is important. And increasingly we find more and more people that are building application software, whether that's middle tier, front end, whatever, they're touching a database as well. And is this something that you see as well, Donovan, when you talk to people? Is it more full stack type developers?
Yeah, and what I've noticed, so when I say people say they've started to adopt it, what I've noticed is that means we have our front end moving, right? We have our front end in the pipeline, but they usually don't have every layer of their application in the pipeline. So when I say people getting started, it's not as we're all in and our entire solution is being deployed through our DevOps pipeline. It's like we have a DevOps pipeline and our Angular code goes out every day and it's awesome. Like, yeah, but how do you do your database? And then that's again where they don't want to talk to you anymore, right? Like they're
Right.
embarrassed to admit that the
Right.
lion's share of the application is still deployed manually, but they can say they're doing DevOps because their front end goes out. Because what they were doing was like, look, we want to focus on the part that changes the most. And I'm thinking, well,
Right.
if you free your mind, it all can change equally as frequently, but you just got to free yourself. But no, I see that very often. A lot of people are very interested, and some people are kind of dipping their toes into it. And the way that I look at
Yeah.
this, which is interesting, is that DevOps is kind of like, to me, it's like a maturity model. You usually do start off with the easy part, which is the front end, right? I'm just going to do some Xcopy deploys of my web application. This is cool. I'm seeing some benefit. I'm running some unit tests. Oh, wow. Let's add not only unit tests, but let's add some integration tests. Oh, let's go ahead and add some security scans. Oh, wow. We have to change the database now. Can we get that into the pipeline as well? So as they become more confident and mature in their pipeline, I see them adding more and more to it. And I think a lot of companies have reached that maturity level to where the database is the next frontier for them.
Right. And I see similar things. I always talk to customers about baby steps because it does take time. It's a process to get this going. That, Donovan and I could come into your organization inside of a week. We could have your database deploying, but it takes time for the people to catch up and get used to it and get confident and believe in the process and to follow it. So I see this similar thing as well, that it's you start with easy stuff and then you go, and certainly it is a maturity model. And one of the neat things is that we find that companies that start to do this, they get better collaboration between teams. Certainly the DBAs and developer, issue has been there for a long time, but all throughout the stack, working with network people, working with security people, it becomes a more cohesive and better environment in which to work. In addition, you accomplish a ton more, which everybody is happy about.
Right, because the infrastructure team was on the exact same path that we're on right now for the database team, right? Before we had infrastructure as code and all those other types of things, which is really important.
It is. And actually, it was interesting. Last year I was at an InfoSec conference, and I was speaking to some of the people there, and I was amazed how often auditors got up to talk about something, and they always mentioned version control and configuration as code. And they said that is like this number one thing we look for in companies that proves that they're actually complying with whatever we want them to comply with, whether that's something like ISO or it's some legislation. They think it's a huge thing. So it's for everybody, right? You really want to do this for everybody. Now, it's interesting when we go through the report, there's drivers and challenges, and this speed of delivery of database changes the number one driver, which I think is probably true, right, Donovan? Because it's been a challenge to get the database to move with the application as we get new requirements. I'm sure you see that with Azure DevOps, right? That you want to add some feature and we need a database schema bucket to drop data in.
Right, and there are unique challenges there too, especially when you start thinking about. I always get the question of, hey, but we need to roll back too. How do we roll back a database change? And there's techniques that you can. I always say you need to be at least one version backwards compatible with your database schema, so that you can roll back the front end and it'll survive against the schema that was there. And you might have to put triggers in place temporarily to keep V1 and V2 kind of in sync with the schema changes before you're able to drop a column or something like that. But it's this that fear again, in that we need to make sure that we document best practices and different patterns that people can actually apply when they're thinking ahead. Because if all I'm doing is ever adding, it's easy. But if I ever have to remove a column or if I have to somehow massage data as part of my deployment, those are patterns that are a challenge. And we need to make sure that people are aware of that so that they can move and incorporate those database changes in a repeatable, secure way, which I don't think that there's a lot of available information out there that helps people do that. And I think we as an industry, as a community, need to do a better job of making that information available.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there's similar things I preach all the time. And often when I talk to customers, they forget about time as an asset that they have. So, as Donovan said, if you add things, it's easy to take them away, but you can use time to let you make changes. So I don't need to add a column, move some data, and then drop a column all in one deployment. I can do that over time. And if I'm deploying every week, then I have more opportunities to go back and clean up things. You know, I don't know about you,
Absolutely.
Donovan, but I always tell people like you never want to add and drop stuff in the same database deployment. Like always use triggers or use something that will let you add, stabilize, and then drop later. Do your cleanup later.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Because the thing that's so important of is because when you're really new to DevOps, rollback is paramount in your mind. Like, man, we've been trying this. A lot of times the deployment fails for whatever reason. We have to be able to roll back. And if I were to add one column and drop another in the same deployment, there is no rolling back because the
Yeah.
previous version of my app expects that original column to be there, and that column is now gone. So you're in worse shape. You are literally forced yourself into a roll forward. That's the only option because there is no going back. But when you actually do as you described and you add the column that might be replacing another one, but you leave them there for a little bit of a time side by side, such that if you need to roll back the binaries, the front end, you can do so. And the
Right.
application will still be able to run. And then 2 or 3 releases from now, when even if I were to roll back, that column would no longer be necessary. It would be safe for you to go ahead and drop that column. Because I don't know, I've never been in a situation, knock on wood, where I've had to roll back 4 versions, right? It's usually to the
Right.
previous
Right.
version. And if I know the previous version doesn't need that column either, then I could probably go back and clean it up. I kind of think of them like feature flags almost, right? Because eventually a feature flag has to be cleaned up. But you
Right.
only do that after you know that you always want the flag on, which means I don't need that other column. And I would kind of synchronize when I clean up that flag, then I obviously don't need this database column anymore because there is no going back to that particular feature.
Right. And you see this in the slide, right? Because the challenges that people see are often syncing what we're doing on front end and back end, or coordinating our efforts. And it's not that hard to do it. It just takes some good patterns and practices and some communication to make it happen. And you can get much better at
Correct.
it. Yeah.
Correct.
All right. So this I thought was an interesting slide. When they gave this to me and they said, hey, this is one of those things we want to highlight. I like that it's not mostly the developers or the DBAs or the infrastructure ops person that's saying we're making the decision, but it's that often we have management involved here too, which is I think is always good. And probably some of that is the work Donovan and I do to promote this stuff. But you can see all up and down the titles of people, they're a part of this process, and that's what's important, right? Because you have to be coordinated. And I think Donovan, you probably see that as well, that we can't just have the developers talking to one DBA. We need a lot of people to buy into this process.
You do, and the higher up you can get the buy-in, the better, because then you get less resistance down low. When you have developers who see the writing on the wall and we have to do this, but your C-level execs and your managers don't buy in, they're never going to allot you the time and the capacity to go and make these changes. And it becomes very difficult and even frustrating to be in an environment where you know you can do better, but you're never given the resources or time to do so. But when you have buy-in at the higher levels, they're going to make that time for you to go off and make these incremental improvements, because they can see the end is going to be, we're going to be able to out-innovate our competition. But if you're so stuck of catching up and you don't take time to innovate, you're always going to be in this catch-up mode. So it's really important the higher you can get the buy-in. This was true when I was doing Agile training, right? If I could get the C-level execs to buy in on Agile was a good thing. Any resistance I got down below, I could use that as leverage to say, nope, this is what the CEO said. But when the CEO wants to be waterfall, and I'm in there trying to turn this company into Agile, it's just an uphill battle. And the same is true when you're trying to add your database. If you can't get that upper management and C-level exec to agree that the database is a crucial part and has to be a part of our pipeline, then you're going to have an uphill battle getting that to work.
You are, and one thing I like to point out here when we get to this is that DevOps isn't about just going faster and producing more work, because really most of us produce the same amount of work no matter what. But we want to do two things. Number one is we want to do the right work. So we don't want to spend 6 months or a year on a project and then realize that's not what we really needed for our customer, for our requirement. But we also want to write better codes. We want to constantly adapting how we do things to make it better. And at Redgate, we've been really good. Our management has been good in supporting us to allow us to take some sprints or some small sections of time where we go clean up code and we're not releasing a lot of new features. But they also let us change work when we realize that something we've built isn't being used or isn't helpful to customers. We kind of abandon it and change quickly. And I think you probably do the similar thing at Microsoft, right? That when something in Azure DevOps needs to change or we have to adapt work, we just do it quickly.
Right, and we're very data-driven. So we don't just out on a whim decide to change something or delete something or invest somewhere else. We use the data that we're collecting. and that telemetry drives our decision making. And it's really important that you monitor everything that you do such that you can check to see if the change that I just made, did it move the needle one way or the other? We have so many of our customers who aren't collecting any telemetry, and they're making all these changes, and they can't even quantify if that change was valuable or not. So yeah, we do the same thing at Microsoft. And when we find something that's critical that has to get done, it's going to be prioritized such that it's going to be in the next sprint that we're going to go off and do.
Right, and that's what you want to see, because I think it was Iris Clausen. Do you know Iris, Donovan?
I'm not sure if I've met him. I might recognize her face, but I'm not sure if I met him.
Yeah, she's one of our C# MVPs, in the program. But she's an amazing developer, I think, in Norway. And she talked about she just spent like a year working on this thing, and then they decided they didn't need it at the end. And so think about how much cost and effort was wasted there when, if you'd have gotten something out to a customer quickly and then he said yes or no, you could have stopped sooner, right? Which is huge.
Yes. Yeah, and change is coming, right? There's no getting around it. And what I've noticed is the sooner that I show you something, the quicker I can go ahead and determine if we're going in the right direction or not. And another thing that's even interesting is I've noticed that as soon as I show someone something, they get all these new ideas. Because, oh, wow, I didn't really think it was going to look like that, but that's got me like thinking about all these other cool stuff that we can do. And your product backlog instantly gets rearranged based on what they're able to see and visualize, because what they said and what you show them is very rarely the exact same thing, but it's not always bad. So the sooner that you can show them, you can determine if our interpretation of your words is either on target, better than, or worse than what you expected us to deliver.
Right. And actually, there's an interesting story there. I was at Build last year, I think, or 2 years ago, and I was talking to the Azure DevOps team, and we were talking about the CI pipeline part. And it used to be that you could queue a build or you could save your changes if you altered something, but those were two separate steps. And so I was talking with one of the PMs saying, listen, a lot of the time when I change something, I want to build right away. So could I get a save and queue in one dialogue with the commit message? And, there were, a dozen people around the booth at that time, and they all were like, yes, we need that right now. And in like 2 months, the DevOps team had just shipped that. And they said, here, we've got it. Yeah. So now you can save and queue or just save changes, which is fantastic.
Yep. Yeah, listening to our customers is something that we've been trying to do a lot better job of. There's no more that horrible stigma of the ivory tower. Like, we're all available on social media. You can come up to us at conferences. You can tweet at me anytime that you want to. And I'll actually get the engineers who are working on that product involved in that conversation such that we can go and get changes done. I remember I got a tweet about an issue someone was having in Mobile Center at the time. 3 hours later, after I added the individual who owned it, 3 hours later, we had a production fix pushed out into production. So, and we can only move that fast because we're doing the stuff we're talking about in this report.
Yeah, and if you follow Donovan on Twitter, he's at Donovan Brown. You'll see it happen. People will send him a message, hey, this thing doesn't work, and he'll either answer or get a PM or get somebody else at Microsoft involved, and they'll start fixing it right away. And we do the same thing at Redgate. We'll hear about stuff, and it'll go right to the developers instantly. And then often, in a week or 2 weeks or less, we've got something out there. So interesting. There's a few questions have come in. People are asking about more practical things. When I look at this slide, which talks about the practices of building software and the things that are involved kind of in DevOps, as well as where you might use third-party tools. To me, the interesting thing here, Donovan, and I'm curious what you think, is that outside of performance monitoring, the database is typically behind everywhere. Is that what you see in the field as well?
Yep. Again, it's like, it goes back again. I feel like a broken record, but it's exactly what you and I said at the beginning, right? It's the fear that we've all made mistakes in our database, and we could only find them at runtime. And it was colossal, and we're all really fearful of it. So we try to change it as little as we possibly can, and that's why it lags behind so much. And now that we've gotten to this pattern that it doesn't change very often, we're afraid to invest time there because we don't think that we're going to reap the benefits, because it only changes every few months, whereas the front end changes every day. And I think we need to get out of that mindset. So yeah, I do see it lagging behind, but again, I think it's a lot of battle scars and wounds that need to heal that are going to allow us to start to move that faster than we do today.
Yeah, I think that's true. The other thing I think is that you software developers, I mean, I don't really write much software anymore, but the people that write in software are maturing at a faster rate. Like the tools and techniques across the last decade are amazing, especially in terms of static code analysis and security scans and testing. Testing has been one of those things that's been incredible in the last 10, 15 years, how well it's integrated in the software development process for application software. Not so good for the database side. And we need to be better at that stuff.
Right.
At Redgate, we sell third-party tools to help you. I'd love for you to use Redgate tools, but really, I'd like you to just build better software, from the database side. Certainly, right? I'm stunned in the last 5 years how good mobile software typically is. I mean, there's always bad software, right? Somebody just throws something out there. In general, most of the software is really good. Like I rarely have mobile software crashes where, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I constantly did. And they've gotten better.
Right. I think
we should be. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting about the mobile, because I use mobile as an example a lot as well. I think the reason that mobile is so good is because it's so competitive. What I mean by that is that there's a half a dozen apps on your phone or in the marketplace that wants to do the exact same thing the app you're currently using is doing. And if that app were to crash, it only takes seconds for us to go get a replacement for that app. Gone are the days where you and I would drive to Egghead Software, get a box full of floppy disks, and spend hours trying to install software, right? You made an investment in that software, and switching that investment was very painful. But on mobile, it's just a few clicks on your phone, and you have a replacement for the software that you do not like any longer. So they have to be better at software development, because the competition in that arena is so fierce, and to get an alternative for you is so easy that you have to be good at what you're doing. So I completely agree. The mobile is a fantastic example of how good we can get at shipping updates every day if we needed to, and making sure that your applications are solid, because if they're not, we will replace you, give you a 1-star rating, and never be back.
Right. And I wish we felt that way about databases. Not that I want to switch platforms, if I don't like
that regularly,
something, but
sure.
Yeah, but we should have that bar. We should be aiming to be as good as everybody else and do a better job. And so whether or not you use third-party tooling, the stuff on the right, the stuff on the left is important, right? That you are using version control, that you are tracking any issues with queries or updates, or the way that we work with database software. And then, all the automated stuff, you should be doing that as part of your database, because it increases the reliability of the database, which is what we're trying to do anyways. That's what most of us are trying to do. So,
right.
I'd like to see it improve.
Those key practices on the left there, they not only apply to your database, they just apply to any software that you write. There's a lot of people coming up to me and saying, "Hey, Donovan, we're doing AI and ML. Does DevOps really apply?" I was like, if there's software involved, DevOps applies, right? Because you need to be using version control. You need to be tracking your issues. You should be automating everything that you possibly can. Tell me why your application, regardless of what language it's in or what platform it targets, is special, so that you don't want to deliver as fast as you possibly can. Like, no, that makes sense. I'm like, yeah, so why did you, to me, it's like such a weird question on if their type of application or their type of development would benefit from automating all the slow things and introducing high quality from the beginning. Like, of course it is, right? If you need me to tell you, sure, I'll tell you yes. But like, how are you not connecting the dots that this applies for everything, including the database and your containers and your middle tier? And regardless of what you're doing, the whole goal is to ship value as fast as we possibly can. And it takes the things on the left-hand side there to do that.
Right. It's just, software is software, right? It's like if I'm going to build a building, which is that classic analogy, I know I need exits and entrances. I know I need certain material tolerances to handle stress and torque and all those things. That's all the same. Now, the shape of my building, the color, the doors, the windows, that's all different. But that's like our software, right? The fundamental practices are always the same. And I want to ask you this one thing, Don, because it's on here just real quick. So down here at the bottom, very few people, right? 1 out of 5 or less are using containerized environments. Where do you see containers with just software in general and with databases moving forward?
Well, one of the things that I really thought was cool when talking about databases and containers was being able to quickly produce a very good set of data for integration tests, right? But when I don't know, I felt like one of those, like, how did I not think of this, right? Because I was in a car with a buddy of mine, he and I were talking, he's like, yeah, we just spin up a container that has our database in it, and we run all of our integration tests against it, and then we just dump the container and spin up another one when we run them again. I'm like, holy crap, how have I not thought of this, right? That's like brilliant. I mean, so many people struggle to get good sample data, and then they have to figure out how do they rinse and repeat that because it's so expensive to restore. And it's like, no, man, we just spin up a container and we run our test, and then we destroy it and we run them again. I'm like, that's fantastic. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do using containers that are going to allow database development to be quicker. It's going to allow you to test, because another thing that's really interesting is that a lot of people don't realize that when you're doing DevOps, when I think you're doing DevOps correctly, there are multiple stages to get to production. So when you're worried about, ooh, is this migration going to work? You'll know it's going to work because you did it in dev and you did it in QA and you did it in staging, right? So there should be no fear that it's going to work in production, because you made the same changes that you're going to make in production 3 or 4 times already and verified that they actually work. Same thing with performance. You should be testing that along the way such that there is no crossing your fingers and I hope this works in production. It's like, I know this is going to work in production because I've already done this several times. And again, those might be containerized environments in which you're using, which even makes it simpler, right? Because you almost have to bless that image only once, right? Because if the image is good, the image is good. It's not like moving from dev to QA to prod when you're dealing with VMs who might have configuration drift and some other type of things that you have to concern yourself with. Images take so much of that out of the equation to where it even makes it faster for us to move. And that's something that we're investing in a lot on the Azure DevOps team too, is how do we go from, we went from 3 years to 3 weeks, but that's just where we are today. How do we go from 3 weeks to every moment that we want to deploy production fixes, we can do so? And I think containers are going to be a huge enabler for us to do that.
Yeah, I agree. And we've looked at that containerized idea for a long time. At Redgate, we have SQL Clone, which is kind of the large size container technology to give you production size loads to multiple people quickly. But the small scale stuff, as Donovan mentioned, in development to get test data very quickly, consistently to developers and to environments is huge. And I think containers are really going to do for development kind of what version control did for developers, that I can all of a sudden, I kind of know what I have here and I can tell at any point in time, and containers kind of allow me to do a similar thing. So if you're not looking at containers, you should think about it. Yeah, I was just going to say,
absolutely.
Right. It's the wave of the future. And honestly, SQL Server 2019 is going to be built not on containers, but it's going to have capabilities for scale out based on containers and then orchestrating those through Kubernetes. So containers are huge.
Yeah. All
right. So this is an interesting one, Don. I mean, I know you're more of a U.S. guy in general, though you go all over the world. I'm curious what you think about this. For us at Redgate, compliance has been a big deal. We're a UK company. We're bound by GDPR. We have a lot of customers in Europe. And so we have, as we've been building solutions and we talk with customers and we're trying to solve problems both internally and for customers, we find that DevOps really helps with compliance because we can adapt and meet any new requirements quickly. And we're not stuck in this area where we're afraid to make a change or we're afraid to move a process because it's how we've always done it. Is that the same thing for you, Donovan? Do you see that with customers that deal with regulatory issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think Agile did a lot of this, and DevOps just allows you to get those changes out a lot quicker because you have to be able to change your priorities because sometimes there are date penalties for not meeting a regulation in time, and you're going to start paying fines for it. And it's really important for you to be able to identify that we need to get this done quickly, adjust your priorities, and make sure that's the next work that you actually get done. And again, DevOps is going to allow you to take those changes and automate them to get them into production in time such that you're going to be in compliance and no longer have to be in fear of paying fines or penalties for not getting that change in time. So I would be really curious to talk to the 9% that thinks that they're going to have a negative impact by being able to get changes into production faster than they do today. If all the people on here, that's the people that I'd be most interested in talking to, is that 9% who felt this would be a negative impact. Because I can't imagine that if they're doing this manually today, that they're actually doing a good job at it.
Right, or worse, right, that all the DevOps stuff has instrumentation built in, right, and that auditing of what happened or who did it or when it happened or what changed is huge. That's critical for regulatory compliance.
It is, especially when you're thinking about things like infrastructure changes. Infrastructure changes is another one. When you do infrastructure as code, you know exactly what happened to the infrastructure. There wasn't someone going into a portal and clicking around and changing your configuration of your VM or the configuration of your firewall in a completely unauditable way. It's now literally a change in source control approved by your team and acted upon by an automated system. And we can actually track that change from inception to actually being implemented inside of your environment with no, someone must have just gone in and changed it. And when I start doing infrastructure as code, I completely lock down our portal to pretty much you can't get in there, right? Because there is no reason for you to actually have to go and click around in the portal to do anything.
Right. There should be nobody SSHing to a firewall to make a change, right? It should just be a configuration
Exactly.
applied. Right. Absolutely.
Exactly.
And then that kind of leads, right, that one of the huge things with DevOps is you've got to learn from what happens, right? Donovan said that Microsoft is this data-driven company. They get information back that helps them move forward. In the database world, we typically have done that for performance, but we haven't always done it for features and for other things as well. And really, monitoring is a crucial thing to be an effective software development deployment team. And I know, Donovan, you've talked about this before. I've watched you present about all the instrumentation and like application insights and other places that you get from your software and how important it is.
Yeah. Yeah, we collect about 7 terabytes of telemetry a day on Azure DevOps, and in there is performance information. There's feature usage in there as well, and we're able to carve through that and make sure that what we delivered last sprint actually was valuable or not, which is really incredible important because when you're an agile team, you live and die by your product backlog, and the assumption is the most important things are at the top. But if you use telemetry and you deliver the first thing, and your telemetry says nobody used that, you need to now go back and reevaluate the priorities of the items on your backlog. And you're doing it with data and not just, oh, I don't think that was, or my gut tells me this. Like, no, what does the data say? Does the data say that was the right thing to do or not? And if it was, great, let's do more of that. But if it wasn't, let's take this opportunity to reevaluate what we think is important, re-interview our stakeholders, and find out what we thought was important wasn't. Let's do some experiments here, and let's see if the telemetry tells us we've made an improvement or not. You have to monitor everything that you do, because if you don't monitor it, how do you know if the change that you just made was valuable or not? As far as your lead time, your cycle time, the performance improvements you're supposed to be making on your database or your application, if you don't measure it, you're just assuming that you made value or you delivered value. But when you measure it, you know for a fact if you did or did not deliver value.
Yeah, and I think that's huge. And again, at Redgate, we make monitoring software for SQL Server, but really it's that you should be monitoring your system, right? Whether you do it yourself, whether you use a tool from Microsoft, tool from Redgate, you write your own, you got to have something that you're doing, because otherwise you just don't know, and you're operating blind. So the cloud is an interesting thing, because when I first heard of the kind of the cloud, I thought it was a neat idea. And what I really thought was that it would change some of the choices we have in the way we do things. And so many database people were against the cloud. But over the last, I think 5 years, that started to change. And you can see here, a third of the people are really mixed hybrid, which I think is what Microsoft really talks about a lot these days. And then, almost 1 in 5 are mostly cloud or all cloud. And I'm sure you guys see that, Donovan, with Azure DevOps. I bet you Azure DevOps is more popular than TFS, is it?
It's getting there. We still have a stronghold on TFS, again, for regulatory reasons, going back to what we just talked about. Some people have data sovereignty issues. Some people just are fearful of the public cloud. So TFS is actually still a growing product, but the popularity of VSTS, or now Azure DevOps, is greatly, it's turning into a nice hockey stick for us, because the fact that it's everything that you know and love about the on-prem product with none of the maintenance, right? We're going to upgrade it for you, back it up for you, scale it for you. It's just like, why would you not want to be here? And the only reason that we have people not going there is for regulatory reasons, or just fear of having their intellectual property in the cloud. But there's a cool hybrid there as well, right? Because we're seeing some hybrid on this particular screen, and you can actually have your source control on-prem, but everything else orchestrated in the cloud, and have this nice hybrid environment where you're taking the benefits of having us updated every 3 weeks for you, but then having the security that your intellectual property never sees the internet. And I think that's why we're seeing so much of this mixing and combination here in the database as well, is people are starting to get more comfortable, and they're needing to let's put some non-risky data out there first, right? Let's take some non-mission critical databases, and let's put those in the cloud and see how that works. And if we start to feel comfortable there, then we'll start to move our more critical workloads to the cloud as well.
Yeah, and I see that database as well, that more and more people are putting something that isn't regulatory impacted or sovereignty issues. They are trying to do that stuff in the cloud, because it's incredible to be able to have that operational flexibility to scale up or down, or to quickly prototype or make something happen in the cloud. It's really, really amazing. And I've seen that at Redgate. We've moved most of our stuff to various places, right? Some in AWS, some in Azure, some in Rackspace, but we've gotten away from this we have a huge room of servers spinning in our building. And I think that's the way most people should be thinking these days. Not that you have to go to the cloud, but you should be thinking about it. At Redgate, we've spent really the last 6, 7, 8 years trying to figure out ways to get database deployments better. We've been around for 20 years now. We started with SQL Compare, and so many people love that as a point tool that help you synchronize changes between databases. But we realize that as we go faster, you don't want to click on a GUI interface to say what's different, what do I want to deploy or not deploy. And so we've tried to spend a lot of time in the last 5 or 6 years doing research and trying experiments and working with customers to build tools that help you. And we've kind of come up with this model of different areas that you should think about as a database developer. And whether you use our tools or not, these are just general concepts that I want to standardize and make sure that my team is developing in a similar way to the application software team. We use similar tools and pipelines and flows, and that we have naming standards, we have static code analysis and all those things that everybody else has. And then we want to introduce as much automation as possible to ensure that changes are flowing in a repeatable, reliable manner. And as Donovan mentioned, we don't have somebody clicking around in a portal to make sure things happen. And then, of course, you need some sort of monitoring instrumentation to understand, and then you have to protect your data in some way. And so at Redgate, we know this is kind of this flow of a circular nature that developers go to operations people, and it comes back over and over again. And I love this diagram because the cog shows that it's not a smooth circle. It can be a bumpy circle at times, but ultimately the goal is, as Donovan said, we have to deliver value to our customers. That's really the #1 goal here. It's not to get a ticket done or make a software change. It's that I have to deliver value somewhere along the way. And then with that, I wanted to give Donovan a little bit of time to talk about Azure DevOps, because I'm a believer. After I met him a few years ago, we presented on stage about doing some stuff in Azure DevOps. I was really sold. I mean, I'm constantly impressed with what is available on the Microsoft platform. So, Donovan, you want to give us a little spiel, talk a little bit about why this is a fantastic platform for DevOps?
Yeah, the reason I think it's really good is it's everything that you need to turn an idea into a working piece of software. It has your work item tracking, which is where you're going to do all your agile planning, your Kanban boards, your task boards, and everything on this screen links together because Azure Pipelines is where you're going to have your CI/CD, which is where we're going to do a lot of our database changes and manipulations there. Repos is just a Git repository or centralized, right? So we are one of the few people who actually offer you centralized version control or distributed version control. And you can choose which one you want and even have both of them in the same project, which makes transitioning from one world to the other quite easy. Test plans, because quality should not be optional. So we allow you to completely model your testing plans and link your test plans to your work items such that the developer who's working on an item can actually see the manual test cases that the QA team is going to run against their tests. So they don't have to worry about assumptions. They can actually code to those test plans to make sure that when they deliver the code to QA, QA is pretty much just verifying that you did what you said you were going to do and no longer a miscommunication or assumptions were made that now are being logged as bugs when it really isn't a bug. It's just a different interpretation of the feature. And then artifacts is basically where you can store and curate your own list of artifacts that you want to make sure your developers use so that you can actually make sure that it's secure. The reason that we separated out as 5 different services is because you can pick whichever one that you want. You do not have to rip and replace everything that you have. I just did a demo the other day where the only part of this product that I used was pipelines, and I was using every other third-party product you could imagine, even third-party clouds to deploy to, all from a commit to GitHub Enterprise, and it just all works together. So my biggest thing that I love about this is that it works for any language, it works for any platform, and you can use as much or as little of it as you like.
Yeah, and that's one of those amazing things I think people forget, that even though this is an Azure service, if you want to write in Java, it works great. If you want to deploy to an Oracle database or, a MongoDB, it's fantastic. They're completely independent of any language or target platform that there is out there. And at Redgate, we integrate as well. So I showed this to Donovan a few years ago and I thought it was pretty, I think he liked it, right?
This is awesome because in your pipeline now, this is a good example of an application that's using infrastructure as code. So that very first line uses an ARM template to spin up the infrastructure upon which this entire solution is going to be deployed. It also includes an Azure SQL database. that next line actually takes the database changes necessary and brings that database into spec. We're using Docker containers as part of this solution as well. There's an app service that actually hosts a web service that we actually use deployment slots to give us a zero downtime deployment. We're running Selenium tests below it, and I couldn't get it to fit on the screenshot, but below those tasks are actually mobile tasks that actually take a Android application and a iOS application and run them through Test Cloud. So I was able to deploy every aspect of my solution, from the mobile application, the database changes, the container images, the PaaS services inside of Azure, the SQL Server, and the infrastructure, all with a single pipeline. And this is what I tell our customers, this is what you're trying to do. As a developer, all I do is commit code to a repository. That is it. Everything else automatically happens for me in a single pipeline. So I'm not trying to coordinate my database changes with my back tier changes with my container changes. It's all one orchestrated pipeline that just knows what the solution looks like and can deploy it every single time I commit code.
Yeah, and I agree. Like I've seen. So if you ever go to one of the large conferences and you go to the Microsoft booth, you'll see people bring up their pipelines and they'll say, why doesn't this work? Or how do I make this better or something else? And you'll see things just like what Donovan shows, where people are making changes, they're deploying to web services, or they're deploying to thick client installers that people will download, or they're deploying to mobile app stores like the Google Play Store or the iOS App Store. It's absolutely incredible what people are doing with Azure DevOps, and it includes the database. Redgate, we've got integration, we've got tasks that help you do this. Other people do as well. There's no excuse to not include the database in anything you're doing.
Agreed.
With that, we've got a few questions. I know we have a few minutes left. So, Donovan, I thought this was an interesting one. I'm wondering what you think. Somebody says DevOps works well for in-house products. You're deploying your own servers, but can it be applied to shrink wrap software where you don't know the final environment or the target environment it's going to be deployed to? So I'm sure you run into this.
I do,
right?
and that's a little tougher. It's a little tougher in a scenario like that. And when I'm focusing and talking to customers about DevOps, it's about the software that they write, right? How do we allow them to write their software more efficiently? How can we automate as much as we possibly can so that their developers' code makes it from their fingertips into the hands of their users? Now, if you're buying something off the shelf that you need to deploy inside of your organization, we actually have tools that allow you to do that. It's like System Center and things like that will help you deal with that stuff, but I don't see, like, version control doesn't make sense in a scenario like that, right? What would continuous integration do in a scenario where you're buying off-the-shelf shrink-wrap software? So I really don't think that in my opinion, right, this is my opinion, I don't see a lot of the DevOps best practices making a lot of sense when you're trying to distribute a shrink-wrap product across your organization or something like that. Now, if you're the one producing the shrink-wrapped product, now that's a little bit of a different story, because now you can automate the testing of your MSI that you build that you're going to ship to your customer. You can actually have integration tests run on various environments to make sure that it can not only be installed, but that it performs the way it's supposed to. So DevOps is not just for web-based solutions, if that was the actual underlying question. It can be used for any software. So it goes back to what Steve and I were talking about before. These best practices apply regardless if it's a containerized application, a shrink-wrapped application, or a web-based application. If you're writing software, good version control is important, continuous integration is important, integration your test is important, and even your database changes, because there are tools, for example, if you were to use SQL, Entity Framework Code First Migrations, you can actually incorporate that and build it into the app such that when your customer upgrades, the database is automatically upgraded as well. So we're even thinking about that from a language perspective, that the database has to be included.
Right. And at Redgate, we do a similar thing. Like we've gone to, just like EF migrations allow you to kind of go from any version to where we currently are. Redgate with our SQL change automation is the same thing, that we use that migration strategy because it allows me to send a package to multiple customers that may be on different versions without fear of them being able to make that deployment. Whereas the older SQL compare method, where I might build a script, if I send this to different customers on different versions, it may or may not work correctly for them. So I think it's better. And that kind of leads, there's another question, Donovan. Somebody asked about general strategies for kind of moving an application and database to source control and authentication into Azure DevOps when it's a bunch of applications on a database and trying to move forward. And they specifically say, is it migrations or model-based better or worse? I know you're on one side. I think you're on the migration side, right? Or you're on the
Oh, I'm actually, I actually, it's an interesting question, and I laugh only because I've had this debate a lot, right? And
right.
I kind of sit on the state-based side, believe it or not. I'm a big fan of
Okay.
state-based, and I have a lot of my peers on my team are all about migration-based. And what was interesting is after that debate, because we had the debate went on for a while, the conclusion was, you know what? As long as I can version the schema and act upon it in an automated way in my pipeline, I really don't care which one you choose. Now, that being said,
Right.
I think state-based works best on a greenfield application where it kind of can guide you into the decisions that you made. If you have an unwieldy old legacy database and you need to start making changes to it, I think migrations is a much better solution because you can kind of like, okay, we're not gonna worry about getting you where you are, but we're gonna help you get to where you want to go by migration over migration, which I thought was really interesting too. So I think they both are valid solutions, and I think you need to look at where you are in your environment and what challenges you're facing, and see which one of those solutions is a better fit for you. But pick one of them, right? Don't just say get stuck trying to decide. Pick one and move forward. But I've noticed, that's my opinion, right? If you're starting greenfield, I think you can have success with both of them. But if you're going to do state-based, I think you're better off starting with a greenfield application, and then migrations, I think, gives you much more flexibility to deal with a legacy database that has some really weird design decisions made in it for legacy reasons.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with you overall because I think you're right. The way that you talk about it is right. The one thing I'll say, with migrations is that it puts a bigger burden on developers at times because you have to decide the ordering early on, and especially if you're branching and merging, it's much more cumbersome and complex. Whereas state-based tends to make merges a little bit easier. The flip side is there's certain things that don't work in state-based. So like renames, merges and splits are difficult for state-based systems to detect. And in those cases, you really need a pattern development where, like Donovan said, you're going to add stuff only, right? Because that's easy.
Right.
And then later on, we worry about the state-based removal of stuff. So if you're a big, I got to rename columns and tables person, you got to go with migrations. Really, you got to stop doing that. Just please stop doing that. Okay. the, the names of the tables and columns don't matter. They're not that important, right? So
Exactly. They're
stop.
not service to the end user. They're not service to the end user. I remember once, just a real quick anecdote, I was at a company once, and I was demoing SQL Server, the database project inside of Visual Studio. And I right-clicked on a column and showed that I could refactor it and rename it. The guy couldn't get his checkbook out fast enough. I was like, oh my God, we have a misspelling in this column. It drives me nuts. If you're telling me that you can do that and it's going to fix all my store procedures, I'll buy everything that you have. I'm thinking to myself, that's never surfaced to your user. Is it really that big of a deal? But for him, it was that feature sold him on everything that I had. It was hilarious.
Yeah, they're struggling. So anyways, let me see. So there's a few things. Let's see. I don't know. I think we'll answer some of these down the road because we're getting near the end of the hour here. Hey, everybody, we will get some answers to your questions here. We'll go through and get out. If you want to get a hold of Redgate at all, we're sponsoring this, or get the report, there's links on the screen there. We'll also email you out the deck, so you'll get a hold of that. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to mention here is that at Redgate, we are doing some more of these events. So we have webinars going regularly, but we're going to have some live events later on this year, or at least the first half of the year. We've got a schedule listed. So in the US, UK, and Australia, New Zealand. So I actually will get to go to all of these. So if you come to any of these, please stop by and say hi. And then we're going to do a live broadcast as well on April 3rd, a SQL in the City stream. And so Grant and Kendra and Kathy and myself will all be there. So register for that and join us. Hey, Donovan, thanks a lot for attending and talking. It was a great debate, and hopefully I get to shake your hand somewhere soon, sometime.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of Redgate and just honored to be included. So thanks for having me.
You're welcome, and thanks for coming again. Everybody, have a wonderful day, and hopefully one of us will see you soon. Thanks again.